Okay, we're very pleased this evening to be talking about tree diagnostics with and having Jim McGlone, who kicked us off at our first training on tree anatomy and physiology. So it's great having him back for this. And Jim, take it away.
All right, thank you, Nora. It's good to be back and to see all your smiling faces again. As Nora said, we're going to be talking a little bit about tree disease and tree diagnostics and how you might think about taking care of trees or making recommendations to landowners on how to take care of their trees. But before we get into that, I want to give you this caveat because there was a lot of discussion about this when we rewrote the Tree Stewards manual. And that is that as volunteers, you don't have the training, the expertise, or the liability coverage to be making specific recommendations about chemicals or fertilizer to anybody for any reason. If you want to take what you think you know and use it on your own property and give yourself advice, you can do that, but do not be giving that kind of advice to anybody else. That should be referred to either myself or to Virginia Cooperative Extension. So let's get into it. What makes urban trees get sick? And the overwhelming cause of sickness is stress. It can be stress because of poor tree care, can be stress because of watering either too much or not enough, or flooding or drought. It could be stress that started long before the plant was planted because it was too deep in the root ball. And so it's now too deep in the landscape. There could be girdling roots. It could be the right tree in the wrong place. You may not have the proper drainage for the tree. You may not have the proper pH. I assume you all know about climate, but it may be the wrong climate. As I say that, I remember that Vincent told me somebody planted palm trees in Arlington County. Probably not the best choice. Could also just be that you got started off with a bad tree. Excessive heat is another stressor, and a big stressor of urban trees is insufficient root space. Now, some of these stressors apply whether we're talking about urban trees or trees out in the forest, especially when we talk about water stress and heat and girdling roots. And this stress will set the tree up for, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but for a cycle of decline and ultimately failure. It's just like us. We get stressed. When we get stressed, we tend to get sick because our body is no longer able to fight off diseases that we might otherwise shunt off. So let me give you some definitions as we go forward. The first and probably the most important is the difference between a primary pest or disease and a secondary pest or disease. A primary pest is one that will attack an otherwise healthy tree. And most of these are non-native. Secondary pests only attack stressed or weakened trees. And these are frequently native, but they could be non-natives that are just not as lethal as some of the other non-natives. And the reason for this is because of coevolution. The trees have been learning to defend themselves against these pests, and so it's only when we bring in a new pest like emerald ash borer that we see otherwise healthy mature trees succumbing to them. And things that affect the trees, they can be in poor health because of biotic factors, which is primarily fungi, bacteria, and insects, or it could be abiotic factors, and there's a whole list of them. Weather, construction, bad care, herbicides, changes in hydrology. There's any number of abiotic factors that can affect trees. And we'll talk a little bit about how we distinguish between them. Now, there is this residual emphasis or discussion of things called signs and symptoms. I've never really understood them. The way I use it is if it's a visual indicator of a pest or disease, it's a sign. If it's a change in the tree tissues as a result of the action of a pest or disease, it's a symptom. And needless to say, symptoms can be signs and signs can be symptoms. Be aware that both biotic and abiotic damaging agents can have signs and symptoms. Since we're talking about diagnosis and recommendations, you should be aware of something called integrated pest management. This was a response to Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in which she talked about all the bad things that happen that we were not aware of and weren't paying attention to as a result of using pesticides in general and DDT in particular. She did not say that we shouldn't use pesticides, but what she did say was we should be aware that pesticides have unintended consequences and we should use them sparingly and with great caution. As a result, we have developed this process called integrated pest management. And the first tenet of integrated pest management is that no organism is inherently a pest. So an ant walking across your kitchen counter is not a pest. Organisms become pests when their population reaches a damaging level, and that could be ecological or economic or aesthetic. So one ant is not a pest. 1,000 ants on your countertop, that's where they start becoming pests. But in integrated pest management, we want to first use cultural practices which have little or no environmental impact. The next step is to go to biological control. And then finally, if all else fails, we go to chemical control. So the first step in dealing with those thousands of ants on your countertop would be to wash your countertop. That is a cultural practice. I'm not sure about biological control of ants, but it's only after we've washed the countertop, we've been very careful with leaving crumbs and other foods out for the ants, and we still have the ants, and we might then reach for chemical control in the form of, say, an ant trap. But that would be the last resort, and that's what people should be doing when it comes to controlling their pests. One of the implications of this is just because you have holes in your leaves or just because you have a few spots on your leaves doesn't mean you have a pest problem that you need to treat. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So the first step in diagnosis is to determine whether you are looking at a biotic or an abiotic factor. Biotic pests and disease are usually restricted to a single species or a genus. So they are going to be within a particular taxon. Abiotic factors, on the other hand, affect almost all the plants in the areas. So if, for example, you go to somebody's yard and they've got a maple tree and an oak tree, and the maple is looking sickly, but the oak is looking fine, it's generally an indication that you're dealing with a biotic pest. If, on the other hand, both the oak and the maple are looking poorly, that is likely to be some kind of an abiotic factor. One of those environmental stressors like drought or flooding or excessive heat, or it could be that we had a really funky winter, which we've had recently, where temperatures are, say, 75 degrees on Monday and they're predicting snow for Saturday. Those things can stress trees. It's also possible that what you are looking at is biotic pests that are affecting the two different biotic pests affecting the maple, one affecting the maple, one affecting the oak, but it's tied to an underlying environmental stressor, which brings us to a discussion of why oaks fail in Arlington and Alexandria. And it's something called oak decline syndrome. This is a process that includes both abiotic and biotic factors. And as I've said, it starts with stress. It could be some sort of a widespread environmental stress like drought or a flood, excess water, that would be a flood, heat, that winter fluctuation I talked about. If it's only occurring alongside or near streets and sidewalks, it could be salt, or it could be repeated defoliation. The picture here, as you will notice, is a forest that has been affected by a fall cankerworm outbreak. This is back in 2015. And this is what it looked like in mid-May. That's not what a forest should look like a deciduous forest should look like in mid-May. The leaves should all be out on the trees. The fall cankerworm was out in such numbers that it ate all of the native deciduous leaves or native deciduous leaves off of the trees. Most of the green you see in there is honeysuckle, and there may be a little bit of holly. So that kind of a defoliation event, especially if it happens several years in a row, can be a tremendous stress on the tree and start it down this path. So you have this inciting stress that starts it. Then we have additional factors or additional stress. So it could be it starts with drought, then it gets hit with a flood, then a fluctuating winter, then a really hot summer, and a defoliation. And all of these stressors pile up one on top of the other. And eventually the tree becomes so weak that endemic pests and diseases, in the case of oaks, armillaria root rot is frequently part of this syndrome, and two-line chestnut borer, which is a bronze wood boring beetle that's a cousin of the emerald ash borer, but it's native. These are things that are native and endemic to the area. Trees are dealing with these all the time. It's only when they get really stressed that these things start to pop up. The other thing I've been seeing recently are oak ambrosia beetles. So you'll see these little toothpicks of frass sticking out from the tree. And usually the last thing to hit the tree is hypoxylon canker. This is another endemic fungal disease that really is kind of that last step before the tree dies completely. So it's out there in pretty much the bark of every tree, but it's being controlled by healthier trees. It's only when the tree is really, really stressed and near death that hypoxylon will break out. Because of that, you may hear some people say that hypoxylon is a tree killer. Kind of. If any of you are Monty Python fans, think about the Holy Grail when they're telling him to bring out the dead. These trees are mostly dead when the hypoxylon gets to them. So before we go on, are there any questions?
There is just one question, and someone just wants to ask if Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax County are all considered urban areas?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Urban, suburban, or urbanizing.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the only question in the chat.
All right.
So
So
far.
although this process that I just talked about is called oak decline syndrome, the same thing happens to other species. It just seems to be more prevalent in oaks, and it's certainly been better studied in oaks because of their commercial value. The U.S. Forest Service has done a lot of research on what causes oak trees to just die out in the forest. And we do see this in the forest as well as urban areas. Now, the last time I met with you, we talked about tree biology, and I showed you the tree energy model, which looks like this, if you recall. And tonight I want to talk about how we can use this model as a diagnostic tool. And so let's start with something simple. It doesn't take a lot of effort to diagnose what's wrong with this tree. You can see the hose embedded in this tree. So what happened here is the tree was planted, they put a guy wire on it, and they never took it off. And eventually that guy wire girdled the leader of the tree, the top portion of the tree. So when the tree was planted, it had a nice straight leader like this. Because it was girdled, there were sprouts that came out and took over, and you got this really weird looking tree. So how do we use them? What do we see happening here in the model? Well, the first thing we see happening in the model is the girdling took place somewhere along the trunk of the tree and it killed the canopy. But because this is a red maple and it takes more than that to kill it, what happened was it started growing a new canopy from below that constricted point. So you can look at where growth has occurred on the tree and figure out where the constriction is in the flow of water from the roots to the canopy. Let's look at another example. This is one of my colleagues sent me this and asked if this was root damage. Well, I've modified the model a little bit to acknowledge that the canopy is not a monolithic structure, it has layers. And you can see all the sprouting that's taking place along here. In order for those leaves, those sprouts to grow, they need sugar and they need water. And so we are getting water up into the canopy, and it's not, you can't see it in the picture because the tips got cut off. All that sprouting tells me that something is up there in the very top of the canopy that is killing the tips of those branches and releasing all of those buds along the branches. So in terms of the model, what we would see is not down here in the trunk, but somewhere up in the canopy, something is attacking that tree and it's attacking all of the branches, which would tend to indicate that it is an insect rather than a fungal disease. And the reason I say that is because with fungal diseases, it's usually only one part of the canopy that gets attacked like that, and you start to see dieback in part of the canopy. And so what's happening is that fungal disease is getting into some of the structure or scaffold branches or structural branches and cutting off the flow of water to that part of the canopy. And what you would do here is frequently the case is you'll hear the solution is to get in there and prune off the affected part of the tree and get it away before the fungus or whatever is causing this branch to die gets into the rest of the canopy. So what can cause these things where we have part of the canopy dying, but not the whole canopy? Frequently, especially if it's only a large section of the canopy, it's a vascular wilt, like in that last picture. That would be things like elm yellow or Dutch elm disease or oak wilt, which we do not have in Virginia. But those are vascular wilt diseases. They get in and they start clogging up the vascular tissue and preventing water from reaching some part of the canopy. And as I said, it usually starts in one part of the canopy, works its way down to the trunk, and then spreads to the rest of the tree. Where we see sprouting, it's usually associated with an insect attack. For example, emerald ash borer or that two-line chestnut borer. This is an ash tree, and this is a fairly typical site with emerald ash borer, because what's happening is the borers are eating the phloem and the cambium under the bark and girdling the tree. And the girdling happens faster in the smaller pieces up in the edges of the canopy than it happens down lower where the tree eventually dies. And when those the ends of the branches die, it releases those buds and we start to see sprouting. And then we have things like thousand canker disease, which is vectored by the walnut twig beetle. It carries a fungus called Geosmithia morbidida, and it attacks walnut trees. The beetle bores into the tree and inoculates it with the fungus, and the fungus kills a small, about a $50 or silver dollar size part of the cambium. And once it does that enough around the tree, it can girdle the twig, the tree, and we again see the sprouting like we do with the insect attack. So those would be things that are up above the root system. Again, you're looking for where is there new growth in the tree, and that's an indication of the new growth is happening beyond or below anything that is severing that water connection between the roots and the canopy. On the other hand, if you see something like this where the entire canopy dies all at the same time without sprouting, that is almost always an indication of a problem with the roots. And as you look at this picture, you can probably see this area right down here does not look particularly healthy to me. So usually what's happening then is we have some sort of a disconnect right above the root system, and water is not getting up the trunk into any part of the canopy. So we're not getting any sprouting or any growth anywhere above the ground here. And that can be caused again by things like armillaria root rot. Butt rot is not as likely a cause for this. And I'll talk about that in a second when I show you some pictures. It could be mechanical damage. It could be girdling roots at the ground level. But it is some sort of a problem with the root system. And when you see that, of course, it's time to take the tree down. But you want to emphasize that it is likely some sort of defect in the root system, and it's something they should deal with sooner rather than later if there are targets. And that means something for a large tree with something to hit. And I put butt rot in here because that can potentially be a problem. But if you look at it, this is what we would call butt rot. You can see here was the root system of the tree. There was, it looks like there was a little bit of missing root or some decay right in here. And you can see the center part of the tree is rotting. It's dead, but it still has quite a bit of living and healthy sapwood here. So there would still be channels for water or opportunities for water to get from the roots up into the canopy and support it. The picture on the right is something we call bottle butt. If you recall, I talked about the swaying of the trees, or at least I think I talked about tree swaying and how the cambium produces reaction wood. So what you have here is some kind of a soil wood decay fungus got into this tree and it's decayed the heartwood in here, maybe even gotten into a little bit of the sapwood, but as a result, it's put stress on the cambium, which has produced additional wood to make up for that lost wood. So there is a cavity inside this swelling here. You can see these kinds of swelling other places on the tree. For example, if you look here, you can see a swelling here, which means there is probably an off-center cavity below that swelling, and the tree is growing reaction wood to compensate for it. Nevertheless, this is an indication of possibly a poor stability in the tree, and something that if you are a suburban landowner and and this tree is within striking distance of your house, you probably want to take care of this. It may be an indication this tree should be taken down. All right. Before we get into leaf problems, any questions about using that energy model and thinking about where these vascular issues occur in the plant?
Yeah, there's one question about the root problems. Could a
Uh-huh.
problem with the root system also be that the tree has been planted too deeply?
Absolutely, that can lead to root rot. So root rot has lots of different causes, but planting the tree too deeply can lead to root rot. Mechanical damage of the roots can also lead to rot. And then just that general stress syndrome that I talked about earlier can also lead to rot. And we do have quite a few soil pathogens that like to eat tree roots, because there's lots of carbohydrates and other good stuff in tree roots for a fungi. All right, leaf problems. This is where we get into that idea of, is it really causing any kind of damage? So a person I work with in Fairfax County sent me this picture of her oak tree, and she asked me, what's eating my oak leaves? And I looked at it and I emailed back to her. I said, give me a break. There are 350 different caterpillars that eat oak leaves. And then there are all kinds of other stuff that eats oak leaves. I've got no idea what's eating your oak leaf. But I also pointed out that oak trees and deciduous trees in general produce anywhere from 200 to 300% more leaf area than they actually need for a growing season. So when you have a little bit of damage like this, and I would estimate this as being less than 5% leaf area loss, it really doesn't hurt the tree. So this gets to that question of, do I even need to worry about it? Do I even need to treat it? In this case, they said, just be happy you're supporting caterpillars that are feeding baby birds, and don't worry about it. It's not making that much difference. And quite frankly, most of the things that affect leaves are more of a cosmetic problem than a health issue, unless it's affecting a large portion of the leaf area and it's happening several years in a row. One of the noticeable things that we get are galls. For the most part, galls have no effect on the health of the tree. Well, I shouldn't say no effect, but very little effect. They are a minor stressor. What's usually happening is an insect has laid an egg on a leaf or possibly in a leaf bud. And as the leaf expands, that egg hatches and the larva is causing the leaf to grow these strange tissues. So this would be a spindle gall and a leaf gall on hackberry. This is apple oak gall here. It's called that because it looks like a little like an apple. Witch hazel cone gall. I think this is actually so prevalent on witch hazel that that's actually where it got its name as witch hazel, because they look like witches' hats. These things do not really do much damage. There's a very small larva inside this, these things, that is taking up some of the photosynthate the tree is producing, that is the sugars and the carbohydrates. But again, it's such a small part of the area of the leaf, and they're consuming so few of the resources that it's not really having much effect on the tree. Things that are of concern is bacterial leaf scorch. So this is a group of bacteria that attack a number of different species of trees. And what they are doing is they get into the leaf and they begin consuming the cells, and the bacteria is consuming the cells in the leaf, and it's slowly turning that tissue dead. And as it does so, it's moving through the leaf. And this is one of the distinctive characteristics of bacterial leaf scorch, is this yellow band that occurs between the dead leaf tissue and the live leaf tissue. And that's where the bacteria is actively attacking cells and killing them. So as you can imagine, one of the first things it's going after is chlorophyll, and that's why these cells are turning yellow. There is no cure for this. There is only sanitation as a treatment. And what sanitation means is you would prune out the affected parts of the plant and make sure you rake up the leaves and send your prunings and the leaves off to the landfill. So you want to put it in your household trash to go wherever they send the diapers and all the other stuff that doesn't get recycled. And as you can see, it affects sycamore, mulberry, red maple, sugar maple, sweet gum, American elm, and particularly oaks in the red oak group. So it is something to look out for. It can eventually kill the tree, but it takes a long time because this is a periodic defoliator. So it takes many years, and it has to keep spreading to throughout the canopy of the tree. Another bacterial leaf disease is fire blight. This is something we see in the rose family. On species like pears, hawthorns, apples, crab apples, and raspberries. The rose family, by the way, is famous for its leaf diseases. It's got a lot of them. And it's called fire blight because it attacks these tissues. It'll attack the leaves, it'll attack the stems, it'll attack the fruit and the flowers. And once that bacteria gets done with the tissue, it looks like it's been burned. Again, this is one that we treat with sanitation. So we prune out the affected parts, we rake up the leaves, you put all that stuff in a bag, you go find a nice stand of wild, non-native, invasive calorie pear, and you spread it around there. Actually, I'm kidding about the last part. Again, send it off to the landfill. Calorie pear came to the United States because of fire blight, which was decimating the pear orchards in the Pacific Northwest, and USDA was trying to develop a commercial pear cultivar that was resistant to fire blight. I now see fire blight on calorie pear out in the wild, which I am kind of happy about, but I do know that because it can affect all these other good landscape trees, it's not necessarily a good thing. Rust is another type of, this is a fungal disease again, that affects a lot of different types of plants. It gets the name because of the, you can see the color here. It looks like the plant, the leaves, at least on one of the hosts, is rusting. One of the characteristics of rust is it alternates between two host plants. So for example, cedar apple rust will be have one generation on apples, and the spores from the fungus that's growing on the apple will infect a juniper, generally an eastern red cedar. And it will cause a growth like this on the eastern red cedar. This is what it looks like on the apple. This is what the fungal growth looks like on the cedar when it's dry. This is what it looks like when it's wet. I had a woman call me and tell me she had something that looked like it was from outer space on her cedars. This is early on in my career. I had no idea what she was talking about. Talked to one of my colleagues and he says, probably cedar apple rust. And I looked at a picture like this. And yeah, that does look like it's from outer space. But notice we have cedar serviceberry rust, cedar quince rust. So most of the plants in the rose family can get it, but we can also get ash rust. And the reason we have a grass leaf here is this rust that goes between ashes, not that we have many of them anymore, and turf grass. And again, pretty much the only treatment we have for this. There are some foliar sprays you can use, usually on the dicot form, but sanitation is your best way of treating this, either on the cedar or on the other apple. Here are some other, these are again fungal diseases that cause various types of leaf spot or blotch. Tar spot on maples is very common. This Guignardia on, this is a sclepus. These things almost always get it. I have a buckeye, and by the end of the growing season, all the leaves are curled and brown from this. Again, typically these are only aesthetic. They're not going to kill your plant, and certainly not going to kill it within a single growing season. And I'll talk about how to deal with these leaf rusts or these leaf fungi in a little bit. Powdery mildew is another common leaf fungal disease. One of the ways you deal with this is you plant resistant varieties. You want to go for cultural practices where you've got good air circulation and light exposure. All of these fungi benefit from overhead watering. So if you're gonna water your trees, you want to use some kind of a drip irrigation method or something that's not going to get water all over the leaf surface. Because what you want is a situation where the leaves stay as dry as possible. Anthracnose is another leaf disease. There are a lot of different fungi that cause anthracnose. For the most part, they are defoliators. We usually only see them when we have wet springs, starting on the interior of the canopy and working out. Sycamore anthracnose can be a little bit worse than some of the others. The reason they are not that big an issue on most species is they do cause leaf drop. So you get a leaf that's got this fungal infection and it drops off. If you are seeing that, the thing to do is to rake up those leaves that drop early and again, dispose of them into either a landfill or an incinerator. I'm not sure what they do with the garbage in Arlington and Alexandria. In my neck of the woods, it would go to the incinerator. There is, however, and I'm sure you've all heard about dogwood anthracnose, and as it turns out, there are actually two anthracnoses that affect dogwood. One is caused by a species in the genus Elsino, and this is what we call spot anthracnose. You get these small spots that don't keep getting bigger. It can affect the flowers and the leaves. It's not a fatal disease, and you want to use good sanitation. That means raking up all of the debris and getting rid of it. The one that is fatal is Discula. I believe it's Discula destructiva. This is a fungus that initially attacks the leaves, and as you can see here, it started off with some spots and they grew together, and it keeps going and kills the entire leaf, then works down the petiole and will get into the wood of the tree. One of the things that makes this a bigger problem than some of the other anthracnoses we have is it does not cause leaf drop. So the leaf becomes a source of fungi that then get into the vascular system of the tree and will eventually kill it. It starts in the leaves and it works its way into the stem. So there are a bunch of different things you can do culturally. One is that dogwoods do tend to have stem sprouts, little suckers coming off of them. So if you prune those off, again, try to keep airflow, keep it wet, and sanitation is really important. What we have seen out in the forest is areas that have recently burned do not have problems with that Discula anthracnose. And trees that are growing either at the top of the hill where they're not getting enough water or at the bottom of the hill where the soils are saturated are more likely to succumb to this than the trees growing in the mid slope where they have better watering. I would also say, in my experience, dogwoods do not like to grow in full sun. They get all kinds of weird leaf diseases. The best place to plant a dogwood is at the drip line of a larger tree, where there will be good air circulation to keep it dry and it gets some sun, but it's not in full sun. So how do we treat, what do we do with these leaf diseases and what you should be recommending to people you talk to? First of all, most of them overwinter as spores in either the leaf litter or sometimes in the bud. So sanitation is the best way to treat these diseases. You prune out the affected areas or you rake up affected leaves and you send them off to the landfill. When we have, with the fungal disease, there are some foliar sprays that you can use, and some of them you use just as the leaf is beginning to break out, just as the tree is starting to leaf out, and that's for those fungal diseases that overwinter as spores in the buds. And with some of them, there are also foliar sprays you can use when the disease is noticed, especially with powdery mildew. You can spray during the growing season. The other thing is to keep the leaves as dry as possible. So sometimes you want to do crown thinning to get good air movement, or plant in a place where you're going to get good air movement through and around the crown, and no overhead watering. Remember, I said a lot of those anthracnoses occur in the early spring and start in the center of the tree. That's where we get poor air circulation, so those leaves are staying wet and creating a good bed for the fungi. All right, before we move on to phloem feeders and other insects, any other questions about fungal diseases or leaf diseases?
Yeah, there's one question about the bacterial leaf blight, whether it's related to wet weather and if a drier season will solve the problem.
Not as far as I know. The bacteria is really getting into and attacking the individual cells in the leaf. And so if we have really dry weather, like a drought condition, that can actually exacerbate it because the leaves are, because the that's going to cause stress, and it's going to, the tree is not going to have as much energy to deal with the infection.
Okay, that was
All
the
right.
only question.
Okay, so we have bugs that attack the tree itself, and we have phloem feeders or sap feeders. These are the ones you're concerned about. We have other bugs that bore all the way into the center of the tree and live in the heartwood. And remember, the heartwood is dead. So aside from the small aperture that they're making going through the sapwood to get into the heartwood, they're not really affecting the tree. It's these things, particularly in the family Hemiptera. These are the insects that have piercing, sucking mouth parts, things like scale and aphid and adelgids, that really cause health problems for the tree. Insects in the family Hemiptera, excuse me, the order, it should be the order Hemiptera, not the family, the order. That's a little higher taxon than family. But insects in that are in the order Hemiptera go through incomplete metamorphosis. And this is important because what that means is as soon as they come out of the egg, they start feeding on the sap of the tree, whether it's a scale, an aphid, a adelgid, or spotted lanternfly also fits into this group. So they are feeding throughout their life cycle in the same way. They have lots of predators, particularly the aphids, but there are also scale and adelgid predators out there. And because they are feeding, especially this group, these insects in Hemiptera are feeding on the sap. Sap is a really good source of carbohydrate. It's basically sugar water, but there aren't many nutrients in it. So they have to process lots of sap to get those nutrients. And they usually have an organ which can strain out the nutrients and some of the sugar and then excrete the rest of the sugar water that they're pulling out of the tree in something that is called honeydew. This is basically water with dissolved sugar in it. And what happens then is, and you can see all this black stuff on this leaf, that is sooty mold that is growing on that honeydew, that sugar water. The sooty mold itself is not a problem for the tree unless it starts coating all of the leaves and cuts off sunlight to the cells for photosynthesis. It can be removed fairly easily with some soapy water, but it does make it easy to find infestations of these very small insects. A couple of them I want to call your attention to. Crepe myrtle bark scale. This is a new pest. It is a non-native pest of a non-native species. It first turned up in Mississippi, I think about 5 years ago. And 2 years ago, I took these pictures in the city of Alexandria. You can see it is a white scale insect. It creates this kind of white velvety look, usually on the branches. It is a soft scale. So one of the diagnosis for this is to put a piece of white paper up there and run your hand over the back of it, and that will squish these soft scales that have red, it's not blood, but they have red fluid inside, and so they'll leave red spots on that white paper. And notice the sooty mold. These things are taking enough of the sap out of the tree, as you can see how many of them there are and how thickly they coat the bark, to significantly reduce the vigor of the tree and eventually kill it. Crepe myrtles in our urban areas are particularly susceptible to it because they're frequently planted by themselves out in a place where they're in full sunlight. And a recent study they did in Raleigh found that trees like that, and like our street trees in tree pits, they're good habitat for these things, but not much else. Another one is of some concern in urban areas is gloomy scale. This is actually a native scale insect. It's usually a minor secondary pest of maples, but in our urban settings, it has become almost a primary pathogen. It's mainly on red maple, but will go after other maple species, in particular sugar maples. And the most telling diagnostic for this or symptom is the black bark on the trunk. So what we're seeing is if you go to Richmond and drive up and down in the residential neighborhoods, they planted a bunch of sugar maple and they all have black bark and they are all dying because of gloomy scale. I mentioned spotted lanternfly. This is no longer the newest kid on the block. We now have elm zigzag sawfly down in this area of Virginia. But that seems to be going pretty much only after Siberian elm at the time. This is the distribution of spotted lanternfly as of January 20th this year. Notice we have a whole bunch of disjoint populations, including one way over here in Indiana and all the way down on the North Carolina border. As I said, these bugs go through this incomplete metamorphosis. So this is what the eggs look like. Please be on the lookout for things like this. It almost, to me, it looks like a piece of chewing gum that's been smashed up against something. They usually lay on, in their native range, one of their favorite places to lay eggs is on Alanthus. We found it on all kinds of surfaces here in the US. We think it got to the US on a shipment of stone that came from China. I don't know why Chinese stone is better than US stone, but there it is. The type of surface that I think of with these things is rusty metal, because we have found them on rusted barrels. So it's not quite perfectly smooth, but something quite smooth with a little bit of texture to it. And then they usually cover them over with this kind of shield that will get brittle and flake off eventually. And you'll see these rows of barrel-shaped eggs that they lay on them. When they initially hatch, the first 3 instars are these little red guys that get progressively larger. They've got the black racing stripes and the white spots. And then the 4th instar, just before they become adults, are all black with white spots. And then they become the adults. These things are about 1 inch long, so they are essentially, they're actually leaf hoppers, but they are essentially very big aphids. In these infested areas, they will occur in numbers large enough to cause agoraphobia, that is fear of the outside, in people who live there. I don't have a picture in this presentation, but I've seen pictures of these things on a cherry tree where they are so thick it looks like the bark is moving and you cannot see the bark for the bugs. My biggest concern right now with them, they are a huge agricultural pest. These are nymphs on grapevine, and they have significantly reduced fruit production in vineyards and apple orchards throughout this infected area. It's not clear that they are able to kill a tree outright by themselves, but they can become one of those inciting factors in that decline syndrome we talked about. My bigger concern is the sooty mold and the honeydew that they produce. Most of our big bee kills have been as a result of treating for honeydew on parked cars in parking lots. This is just going to make it that much worse and put that much more pressure to be spraying on trees that we shouldn't be spraying on when bees are out actively nectaring on those trees. And a little bit out of order, back to those small things, is Hemlock woolly adelgid. This is pretty easy one to diagnose. You just look at the underside of the hemlock, and you'll see these little white things at the leaf axils where the leaf joins the stem. And we also have, I mentioned emerald ash borer earlier. It is also a phloem feeder. It feeds differently because it's a beetle. It's in the order Coleoptera. And what's happening is the larva is actually tunneling under the bark and eating the cambium and the phloem directly. So all those insects we've talked about so far, they've got those piercing, sucking mouth parts that they're sticking into the phloem and sucking the sap out. This thing is actually eating the phloem. And there are a few other, particularly these metallic wood boring beetles that attack the tree the same way. So how do we treat for these phloem feeders? Well, one way, a cultural way, is to plant a diverse group of plants. Plant diversity will attract a lot of the biological controls that we have for them. For example, ladybird beetles are feed primarily on aphids when they are adults, but also when they are larvae. So these are good things to have. In fact, you can buy these things, but they don't usually work because you release them in your yard and they fly everywhere. It's better to have plant diversity to attract them. Systemic insecticides can be used, and I put some systemic insecticides ahead of foliar treatment for two reasons. One, that is a more targeted approach. These insecticides are introduced into the tree, or can be introduced into the tree through stem injections, which means it's only going into the tree, or by root soaks, which means it's going into the tree, but also anything else that's accessing that soil. And especially when we're looking at ash trees and hemlocks, which are not pollinator plants, we don't have to worry as much about affecting our pollinators. The other thing is you can use systemic insecticides on very large specimens, whereas foliar treatment on large specimens is generally going to be ineffective because it's really hard to cover a 90-foot ash tree, for example. Also, the foliar treatments do not work for the beetles. It only works for the hemiptera. For soft scale, like that crepe myrtle bark scale, if it's a small enough plant, you can just use soapy water and a stiff bristle, not a wire brush, but a stiff bristled brush. Because they are soft, they are easy to damage and to kill those things with the bristles with a stiff bristled brush. You don't want to use a wire brush because that's going to tear up the bark of the tree. And it won't work on hard scales because they're hard. All right, looks like we got a lot of questions about insects.
Yeah, let's see. Somebody has said that she has seen woolly aphids on an ash tree several years in a row, causing sapping and leaf curling. Is it fatal, and what should you do?
Generally, it's not fatal. There are a number of these things, adelgids and aphids and things like that, that are kind of waxy. I've even seen, there is a beech branch aphid that is white and fuzzy looking like that. But like I said, they're usually not fatal to the tree if they get to be, if they're low enough down and they get to be enough of a concentration, you're worried about losing that branch. One of the things you can do is to prune off the branch that's affected and get rid of it. You can also use foliar treatments on these things if you can reach them. If it becomes really, really big problem and you absolutely have to do something about it, then that's when you would go to a systemic.
Okay, and then about the spotted lanternfly, somebody says that she has found 5 tree of heaven on her church property, and what should she do if she finds the eggs?
If she finds the eggs, she should contact Virginia Cooperative Extension, or she can contact me, or she can contact Vincent, or if it's in Alexandria, John Marlin. She can also go, there is spotted lanternfly in Virginia. There's a place to report it on the internet. But what we're looking for there would be egg masses. So if she sees the egg masses on the tree, you want to, as part of the report, take good pictures of them. And as soon as that report comes in, VDAX will send somebody out to look at it. It'll probably be me or Kirsten or both of us as a first method, as a first step. And if she can, if you can reach it and you see those egg masses, first you take the picture, then in an abundance of caution, you scrape them off and drop them into a bucket of soapy water. You need to have soap in the water to break the surface tension so they sink and they drown.
Okay. Somebody's asking, what is an internal state quarantine area?
For the spotted lanternfly, that is a quarantine area that has been established by VDAX. It's going to expand. This is an effort to try and keep or slow the spread of the spotted lanternfly. And I should have mentioned this. If you go into an area that is infested with spotted lanternfly, you should do a thorough inspection of your vehicle before you come back, because these things are great hitchhikers. And that's how we think, that's one of the ways we think it's spreading, because it seems to be spreading along the rail lines. One of our great fears is that the infestation in Prince William County is right near Manassas Regional Airport. And the Virginia Rail Express and a freight line all go through that area, and we're afraid some gravid female is going to hitch a ride on a plane or a train or something else and really bust out of that and spread regionally. But unlike a lot of other bug quarantines that deal with forestry, this is on pretty much anything, because they will lay their eggs on tractor trailers, on vehicles, on Jersey walls, on almost any kind of a surface like that. So you really have to do a good job of looking for them and making sure you're not bringing them back.
Okay. Okay, and then a last question here. Someone is asking, if you're brushing a small ash tree with soapy water to get rid of beetles, what time of year should you do it?
You can't get rid of the beetles with soapy water, because they're going under the bark. It is the only way to treat the beetles is with a systemic insecticide. The soapy water would be for aphids or scale or adelgids or something like that, that are feeding on the surface and you can actually get to it. But the beetles are under the bark. They're almost impossible to get to with any kind of an exterior application. You have to do the use a root soak or an injection of a systemic.
Well, what if you were going after one of those other ones, like the scale? What time of year?
It would depend on the type of scale. Extension has lots of calendars or information on the best time to treat different types of scale. So first you get a diagnosis of exactly what type of scale it is, and then you can look on the internet for treatment periods. In general, if you have a relatively small infestation, if it's aphids or adelgids or soft scale, you can do that pretty much any time because they are very susceptible to it. The hard scale, once they get hardened off, are very difficult to get rid of that way.
Okay. Oh, and then we got one more question that just came in. Do you have a website for Virginia Extension?
Yes, I will give you that at the end.
Okay, I think you can Google it too, Virginia Tech.
Yeah,
Extension.
Virginia Cooperative Extension. So their office, I don't know whether they're open yet or not, is in the Fairlington Center. Over near, what is that? Not Quaker Lane. Yeah, Quaker Lane over near Shirlington.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I think that's it for this segment.
All right. So I'm going to talk about a few things now that didn't really fit neatly into either of any of the other categories we've talked about. I mentioned signs and symptoms. So this, if you ever hear anybody talking about frass, this is what we're talking about. This is a little bit of a cheat. This is a dead tree. It's got all kinds of borers in it, but you can see it's sort of like sawdust. Frass is basically sawdust mixed with insect poop. And in some cases, it's just insect poop because the wood has been processed through the insect. Oak trees, particularly pin oaks, tend to get, this is what's called a horned oak gall on the stem of the leaf. Again, this is not, even with heavy infestation, this is not hurting the tree. It is of historic importance. One of the things, one of the biochemistries of these galls, these hard galls on the oak stems, is that they do cause the tree to produce a lot more tannin in these galls. So in colonial times, they would go out and harvest these things and grind them up because that tannin was used not only for tanning leather, but also for making iron oak gall ink. So it was used in the ink making process, and it was iron oak gall ink that the founding fathers used to write the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. You may also see leaves that have been rolled up. This is an insect feeding strategy. The insect will roll up the leaf and feed on the leaf tissues on the inside of the roll. You notice there are two damaging holes here. I don't know whether those are exit holes or whether that is predation, where something looked at this and said, aha, there's a meal inside there, and they bored into this roll to get to the what you call it. Don't usually see a lot of this excuse me, on trees, and it's usually nothing other than something cool or aesthetics. Decay shows up in a lot of different ways. You can see the decay here with the wound wood around the outside. We'll probably see some of this on our walk on Saturday. And one of the things you want to look for when you see something like this is whether the decay is ongoing or whether this is just fairly, or whether this is sound dead wood. You can also see this is a bad pruning cut. You can see the decay in here with the streaking and the rot and the discoloration of the wood. And then of course you can also get fungal fruiting bodies associated with decay. Usually these small things like this are sapwood rots, and the big shelf fungi are heartwood rots. One of the things I would point out is the stuff on the outside of this tree, this green stuff, is lichen. This is not decay. This is not a disease. This is not a problem for the tree. The lichen is simply hitchhiking on the bark of the tree, and it doesn't hurt the tree. So If people ask you about that, no, they don't have to worry about it. There are some unscrupulous tree services that are charging people a lot of money to remove lichen from their trees. Another vascular fungal disease that becomes evident is black knot. You see this particularly on cherries and plums, but you can see it on other members of the genus Prunus and potentially on other rose family trees, which would be things like serviceberry, pears, apples, and things like that. What happens is, again, it starts in the smaller branches. It causes these cankers and these black swellings, these knots on the tree, and it will progress further down into the tree. The only way to treat this is with sanitation. You get in there and prune it out and get rid of the infected tissues. You will sometimes see environmental deformities on the tree that are linear. It can be caused by lightning. Lightning is usually a very long scar that reaches from close to the top of the tree all the way to the base. Frequently, it will spiral on the base. So this is a lightning scar. This is another lightning scar. This, on the other hand, is a frost crack. These usually occur on the southwest side of the tree, and it's caused by, there's frost cracks and then there's sun scald. These are both caused by rapid shrinking and swelling of the tissue. The difference between a frost crack and a sun scald is frost crack actually creates a crack and you get tissue separation underneath, whereas sun scald only kills the cambium and sometimes will affect the bark of the tree, and usually is accompanied by this kind of oozing, whereas you don't see that with the frost crack. And like I say, it's usually on the southwest side of the tree where it'll warm up on after a cold night during the afternoon sun. So if you move to the southern hemisphere, it's going to be on the northwest side of the tree down in the southern hemisphere. Another fairly common problem is interveinal chlorosis, and this is yellowing of the leaves between the veins. So you can see here this yellow tissue with the relatively bright green vein. This is, of course, a sweet gum, and this is usually an indication of an iron, a manganese, or a zinc deficiency. If it is an iron deficiency, it'll start in the young leaves and progress to the older leaves. So it starts at the outside of the canopy and moves in. And if it's manganese or zinc, it'll start in the older leaves and progress to the younger leaves. The reason for this difference in progression is that iron, once it is in place in the tree, is fairly immobile, whereas manganese and zinc are very mobile. So what happens is the tree will, if it's a manganese or zinc deficiency, the tree will mine the manganese or zinc from the older leaves when it's making younger leaves. That's why it starts on the inside and works itself out. By far, the most likely cause is going to be iron deficiency in the leaves. So what can cause iron deficiency? Well, one thing is low soil iron, which is very unlikely in Virginia. Our soils are red because of the iron content. It's all iron oxide that's giving us those red-orange soils. But if you do a soil test and it turns out you're low on iron, then the simple solution is you add iron to the soil. A more likely cause is high soil pH, which will occur particularly in suburban areas because people are putting down lime to raise the soil pH for their grass, but it also raises the soil pH for the trees. And then what happens is, as you raise the soil pH, you are increasing the number of hydroxyl ions, that's OH, and they combine with the iron to make an insoluble Fe, or iron oxide that has hydrogen atoms in it. And so there's plenty of iron in the soil. It's just not available to the plant because it's insoluble. When you have high soil pH, what you want to do is add sulfur or iron sulfate. Another potential cause of chlorosis is high phosphorus. This is why you never fertilize unless you have a soil test that tells you you need more phosphorus. Phosphorus does two things in the soil. One is it will combine with the iron to make iron, an insoluble iron phosphate, just like you get what happens with the high soil pH. And because it's insoluble, the tree can't get to it. But high phosphorus is also affecting the biochemistry of the tree and reducing iron uptake from the tree, even if it's available in the soil. So you should always get a soil test before, if you think there's a nutrient deficiency, before you add anything to the soil. And this is what a soil test kit looks like. You can get these from Cooperative Extension. I don't know about Arlington and Alexandria, but they're also available at all the supervisors' offices and the libraries in Fairfax County. And one last thing I wanted to point out, people frequently see carpenter ants and they get all freaked out. And it's actually good to get freaked out when you see carpenter ants, but not because of the carpenter ants. The carpenter ants do not hurt the tree. So we talked about signs and symptoms. Carpenter ants are a sign of rotted wood, because carpenter ants nest in rotted wood the same way that other ants nest in the ground. So the ants themselves are not hurting the tree, but they are letting you know there is decay in the tree. Similarly, if you have carpenter ants in your house, that's an indication that you've got rotten wood in your house. And you might want to get somebody to come in and inspect your frames to make sure they're not what's rotting. Okay, so if you see carpenter ants, you're not going to treat for ants. You're going to figure out what's causing the decay in the tree and treat for the decay, not for the ants. And I think I only have a couple of slides here on what you as a tree steward should and shouldn't do. If you go to a homeowner's visit, the first question is it a problem? Remember what I said about those leaves, that they've got holes in them, but not enough to be worried about. You also need to know what species you're looking at, what's normal for the species. I have talked with some city arborists who say they don't like to plant bald cypress because when they have planted it in the past, they've gotten all kinds of complaints that the trees that they planted in the spring are all dying in the fall, because most people don't understand that bald cypresses are a deciduous conifer. It's normal for those leaves to come, those needles to come off in the fall. That's how they work. If you look at the tree, you want to give them some sort of a general indication of the problem. So if you're seeing dieback and sprouting, that can be a sign in part of the canopy, but not all of it. That can be a sign of vascular wilt. If you're seeing dieback and sprouting throughout the canopy, that is generally a sign of insect damage. And if you're looking at an ash tree or a walnut tree, you can narrow that down to emerald ash borer or thousand canker disease. Give them a general indication of the treatment options. Remember, I started by saying you should not be making specific recommendations on chemical use. But you can say, well, yeah, if it's this problem, You can, for example, if you see a leaf fungus, there are foliar sprays that you can use to treat the leaf fungus. But do not tell them what. At that point, then you say, well, you should talk with cooperative extension or talk with forestry, or go to your local nursery and get a recommendation for a specific product or a specific chemical to use on that. We can also talk about cultural practices, and if there are any biological practices that you can use to treat those things. And as I said, recommend further, more specific diagnosis to a certified arborist or to Virginia Cooperative Extension through their Master Gardener help desk. And then you can collect samples or tell them how to collect samples. And what makes a good sample is you want to be showing the distinct symptoms of what you're seeing, what the problem is. You want the sample to be fresh. So if you're going to collect a sample, you should do it with the idea that you are going to immediately that day head over to the help desk to turn in that sample. You don't want to take a sample and let it ride around in your car for a week, because it's not going to be anything useful at that point. You want a whole section of a branch or a handful of leaves. You want to give them both affected tissue and unaffected tissue. And you need to tell them what kind of a plant it is. There is a form that you got to fill out. You can find it online under Virginia Cooperative Extension. It will let you know exactly what questions you have to answer. But the most important thing is, don't just send them one leaf that's infected. Send them a branch that has both uninfected, or what you think is uninfected, and infected tissue. And it's really important that you be able to identify the plant. You can go online. There is this 20 questions for plant problem diagnosis. Some of this would apply to you. Some of it may be a little bit, this was written actually for people who do more specific diagnosis, but certainly knowing what the plant is, what's normal, what are some of the common problems of the plant, what looks abnormal. These are things that you should always be observing when you're starting to try and figure out what might be going on with the plant. And finally, here is the some sources. The U.S. Forest Service has a whole bunch of pest alerts, like this one for hemlock woolly adelgid. Treesaregood.org is the International Society of Arboriculture. When you are searching, unfortunately, with the internet, anybody can put anything on the internet at any time, regardless of its validity. So I strongly encourage you to end your, or put at the end of your search request .edu, because excuse me, that will bring you to university research information. And I apologize, I don't have the exact website for Virginia Cooperative Extension, but this is their address. This is who you can email with questions, and this is their phone number. They may or may not be accepting live samples right now. For, during COVID, they were only taking picture samples. And there's information under Virginia Cooperative Extension, Arlington Master Gardeners, that will tell you exactly how to do that. And once again, this is me and how you can get hold of me. And now I will answer your questions for as long as you have them, or as you are posing them.
Okay. Before, let's see. Well, let's see. I'm not sure we have any new questions. I did put the address for the state extension service, the website address, and also for the local Arlington extension office in the chat. So if anybody wants that specifically.
Okay.
And Yeah, so aside from that, we don't have any other,
Well, I
Questions?
do have a question.
Uh,
And that is, Jim, if we like go to a homeowner's place
uh-huh.
and we want to talk about ways to keep your mature tree healthy, I love the way that you describe encouraging people to mulch their trees.
Yes.
So if you'd say a little bit about
Sure.
what do we do to encourage people to keep their trees healthy?
So this goes back to one of my first slides where I said that the most common problem that leads to decline, decay, and health issues with our urban trees is stress. There's not a lot you can do about environmental stress, but one of the key things that you should keep in mind, and I don't know if I didn't, I know I didn't mention it tonight. I don't remember if I mentioned it when we talked last time, is we have studies that show you get 5 times more tree root mass under mulch than you do under turf. Let me say that again because it's really important. You get 5 times more tree root mass under mulch than you do under turf. The one simple thing that homeowners can do is to pull the turf back and properly mulch that tree. And what I've been learning in the last year or so, proper mulching could be as much as 6 inches of green arborist wood chips, or going back to the usual 2 to 3 inches of wood chip mulch. And you want to try and use stuff that's mostly wood. Bark is evolved in order to be a water barrier. So it is what we call hydrophobic. That is, it doesn't like water. It's got a lot of waxes and oils and things in it that repel water, and its primary function is to keep water inside the trunk of the tree. But as you can imagine, if you use it as a mulch, it's going to be repelling water rather than helping the water infiltrate into the ground, which is one of the things you want your mulch to do. It also gets messy because since it does not absorb water, it repels water, it has a tendency to float away, much more so than wood chip mulch, which will become waterlogged and stay in place. But it will also help infiltrate, those wood chips will help infiltrate water into the ground. The really finely shredded mulches that have become popular lately, that stuff is almost like making paper. It'll lock together and form a mat which repels water, and it becomes both a water and a vapor barrier. So you're keeping water and oxygen away from your root system, which is a bad thing. So to repeat, pulling the turf back, you get more tree roots growing under the mulch. You want to use good wood chips as your mulch. You can also use green mulches, which would be shade tolerant ground covers. Things like golden ragwort, Virginia strawberry, pussy toes, wood anemones. These things you can grow under your trees, and they act as more of a green mulch, but they're still doing the same thing. They're helping infiltrate water. They're maintaining soil moisture. They're keeping the soil cool, which is what you want your mulch to do.
Jim, somebody's asking if the county leaf mulch is good to use.
Leaf mulch is a good additive, but it does, you don't want to put it on 2 to 3 inches deep. It will decompose rather quickly. So you can lay down maybe a ½ inch to 1 inch of leaf mulch and then put the wood chips on top of it. One of the things though to be aware of, remember what I said with a lot of these leaf diseases, is you want to send that stuff to the incinerator, but not all your neighbors know that. So it's not clear to me what may or may not be in that free commercial mulch. the best way to mulch your trees with leaves is to throw away your leaf rake.
I have a question. Hello?
Yes?
I have a question, actually a comment, or well, two questions. First, at the back of the chapter we read for tonight is a list of resources of various websites and publications. Are there are many critters and diseases that we saw about tonight, and I know I will need to refresh my information. Are there some, or are one or two of those publications that you particularly recommend that would cover some of this material so we could review it at more in greater extension?
I'm not familiar specifically with those with the things that are at the end of the chapter. It's been a while since I looked at it. Unfortunately, there are two books that I use. Come on. I don't know why this thing. There are two books that I use that are very technical and probably not of much use to the Tree Stewards. They're also very large and very expensive. I don't know, the Tree Stewards may own a copy. Do you have, Nora, do you have diseases of trees and shrubs and insects of trees and shrubs?
Yes, we have
Okay.
those. We, in prior days, we used to have them at our farmers market information tables, but they haven't started up again.
Okay. So those are probably the, in terms of the profession, those are the two go-to resources for this. But in terms of smaller things, I know that various extension services, Clemson has a lot of information on diseases. Penn State also, Virginia's cooperative extension. Clemson, by the way, is the Virginia Tech of South Carolina. So they are the land grant university in South Carolina, and South Carolina Extension operates out of Clemson. Penn State also has the extension service in Pennsylvania, and they've got a lot of information. If you are looking at insect damage, you might look at Maryland, where Dr. Michael Ropp is the known locally as the bug guy. He shows up frequently on public radio when they have questions about insects.
Thank you. Most of the majority of the references at the end of the chapter are to websites from many of those universities. So
Yeah.
I guess checking there would be a good way to look on if one wants to pursue it further.
Yeah, you got to do a little digging to find it on there, but that's why I said use the .edu so that you're looking at good information as opposed to something that my grandpappy taught me.
Right. Another question / comment. Today I was going to the library here in Alexandria, the Duncan branch. Adjacent is a community center. And I noticed that on the grounds of the community center, all of their trees had the mulch volcanoes. And I guess I'm asking, was I out of line? I went inside and made a comment to the manager there that this was not good for trees and they might want to consult with whoever did it. And they said they have a contractor, which is what some of our other lectures have talked about, issues with contractors. So I just said, just pass it on. So was that okay to do?
Yes, that's fine. Was this in Arlington?
No, this was in Alexandria. It was
Okay.
the Mount Vernon Community Center, which is right
Okay.
next to the Mount Vernon Public School
So
and the Duncan Branch Library.
Who's the city arborist for Alexandria?
John Marlin.
So let John Marlin know about it also.
Okay.
One of the things, though, that I have observed is when you look at mulch volcanoes, you need to do a little bit of excavating because it may be mulch volcanoes may not be the offending practice. It may be that when they planted those trees, they only buried half of the root ball.
Oh, yeah.
So the top of the root ball is actually 8-10 inches above the ground. And then when you properly mulch it, it looks like a mulch volcano.
Uh-huh. Well, I'll go back and check it out. But thanks so much.
Yeah. I went out, and looked at a bunch of trees in Alexandria that were planted a few years ago. Is Dick a tree steward? Nora?
Dick, oh yeah, Richard Christensen, yes.
And he felt like, okay, they've been in the ground a couple of years. It's time to start thinking about burning them. And they all had problems with their leaders. And I could see that almost every one of these 50 trees had been topped at the nursery before they were planted. So again, there's a lot of bad information out there. There are a lot of contractors who are not doing good things.
And I think he got those supposedly from a native nursery, but I'll talk with him about that.
Well, the native nurseries are
See
still
what it
buying
is.
from commercial growers.
That's true. They are. They are. Oh. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jim. We've all learned a lot today. I
Okay.
appreciate it.
And
Great deal.
do you want to say anything about Saturday, Nora?